Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Mormon Stories Podcast. I'm your host, John Dehlin. It's March 29th, 2017, and we are here to interview Trevor Haugen. And Trevor is going to be known to many of you and is not going to be known to others. But basically, let me just give kind of the rundown. We interviewed Trevor about sort of in episode 1 of this series about his faith journey, about his mission in Latin America, about his temple marriage, about his second temple marriage, and about his faith crisis, and all of that. And we did all that in episode 1. And then in episode 1, we talked about how we were going to be releasing in episode 2 an audio recording of an interview that Trevor had with his former mission president, who became a general authority, Don Clarke, and Matthew J. Grow, who is in the LDS Church History Department. So that was what we had planned. We went ahead and released the audio recording from that meeting, and then we did a couple hours of analysis with Lindsay Hansen Park, John Hamer, and Glenn Osland. And we released it all. And those of you who have already listened to all that, please don't feel like we're expecting you to tune in and listen to more. But we decided after about a day of having released that, and Trevor, we can talk about this, but basically we decided to take it all down. And we reconsidered the effectiveness of sharing an audio recording that was made in private. And so that's true. However, Trevor still, and I still felt like Trevor's story deserved to be told. And so we weren't comfortable just sort of scrapping the whole project. And so what we've decided to do is to go ahead and have a conversation between me and Trevor where we talk about that meeting that he had with Elder Clarke and with Matthew Grow, but not to release the audio from it. And it's just sort of a practical, pragmatic, and in some cases, ethical decision that we made. And so that's what we're going to do. Over the next hour or two, we are going to have Trevor tell the story of the meeting that he had in March 2017 with Elder Clarke and Matt Grow. And we're going to have Trevor tell the story. I'll help him. And then we're going to analyze those responses. And we're going to release this as an episode on Mormon Stories so that Trevor's story gets told. So with all that disclaimer, Trevor Haugen, welcome back to Mormon Stories Podcast.
Hey, John. Thanks for having me. This is like take 2.
Yeah.
We get it right.
And we're doing the recording live on Facebook Live, not because we expect more people to tune in. Again, if you've already checked all this out and you don't feel like you want to listen to it, please don't. But if you do want to tune in, and right now we have 73 people who have tuned in, we do welcome people to share their questions, their thoughts, their concerns, and throughout this discussion, and definitely at the end, we're willing to take questions, not just about the meeting, but also just about, our decisions to take things down, etc. And again, we don't expect anyone to tune in or listen, but we want Trevor's story to be part of the historical record, and that's why we're re-recording. At least that's why I'm re-recording. So with all that, Trevor, do you want to say anything really quickly about the decision to take down the audio recording? What would you like to say about that?
Yeah, and I think you did a great job in explaining just, really the last couple of days have been a little crazy for us. It's given us some time to kind of reflect on, some decisions that we made. And, really the biggest thing is that, my whole purpose for coming on Mormon Stories is to share my story. It's not to convince or persuade anybody. This is just a very, I wanted it to just be a very raw look at what happened and kind of how it felt for me. I'm not an educator or an expert. I'm just simply somebody with questions that happen to get a meeting with two very influential people of the church. And I think a lot of times, I know what happened with me is when I was meeting with my local leaders, it kind of felt like, well, I might not have the answers, but somebody, kind of higher up might have them, or, I want to introduce you to this person, this person, this person. And so it just kind of got to the point where that escalated, and I found myself in this situation. And another thing to understand is that naturally I'm a documentarian. So I, up to this point in my, in my journey, I documented everything. Since the first week when I started going through this, I just knew this was going to be a big enough deal that I should probably start, videoing myself and my feelings and how I, and just how this was all happening, And so I'm really glad that I did that. And this was just kind of another piece of that for me. It was later on that, after having listened to this several times, John, after sharing this with you, that we decided, we wanted to share this, and I wanted it to be in the best light possible, in the most accurate way possible. And so that's why, we had originally kind of decided to share it, but I do understand that, that people could view it as unethical, and we don't want, the means to any end to distract, or make us less effective in sharing stories, so that's my take.
Yeah. And it was a really tough call because on some level, the church makes such important claims. The church expects so much of its members, and it's not often forthcoming in these sorts of conversations that from a journalistic standpoint, there are many people who feel like it's fair game, especially if there's suicides or families at risk, that it's fair game to have them be on record, especially when it's legal to obtain that record. I think that's a fair argument, but it's also a fair argument to say it's a breach of trust and unethical. And so it's just a difficult choice. So anyway, should we dive in?
Let's do it.
All right. So what was the date? What was the date that you met with Elder Clarke and Matthew Groh?
This was March 3rd, 2017.
Okay, and where did you meet exactly?
We met at the Church History Museum.
Okay, in a room, just some room there, or is it in?
Right. So we went up to the third floor, I believe, and that's where Matt Groh's office is, and we just kind of went in there and sat down and had a conversation. It was me and my wife and Matt Groh, and then Elder Clarke was kind of sitting by the side of Matt Groh's desk there. And so it's kind of the four of us engaging in conversation. My wife didn't participate too much, but and actually Elder Clarke didn't engage very much as well. I would say, gosh, 80% of it or so was kind of a conversation between me and Matt Groh.
Okay. So it, as we've talked about it, the meeting was framed around an email that you had sent Elder Clarke, and that had been shared with Matthew Groh. So I think as part of the structure for this interview, why don't you go ahead and we'll read each of the main questions that you offered, and then try to retell the story of what happened with each question. Is that okay?
Yeah, that sounds great. Yeah.
So why don't you read the first question or issue in your email, and then I'll follow up.
Right, and just to give a little context too, I did meet with Elder Clarke prior to this meeting. We went to lunch, and the purpose of that meeting was to just kind of have a candid conversation about some of my concerns. As you'll remember from part one, Elder Clarke was my mission president, and so I figured the amount of time and also his close relationship with the higher ups in the church, he would know some good answers to these questions. To be completely kind of open with where I was at this point. I was already disaffected. I mean, this is after I had met with my family. This was kind of the last kind of my final prayer, if you will, just giving the church maybe one more shot. I wasn't going into this wanting to debate the issues as much as I was just wanting to kind of just understand one final time what it is they actually believe and how they believe it, and so I felt like I was going into it with an open mind, but at the same time, I did want to share my perspectives with these guys. And so when I originally met with Elder Clarke, Elder Clarke didn't have really anything to say about the issues. It was just that he knew people that were, more maybe a little smarter than him, is what he said, on these issues, just because he doesn't have time to really investigate all of this stuff. And so to put it in an email, and he was going to share it with some people and see if he might be able to help me get some answers. So that's kind of what led to this meeting and the email that I drafted.
Okay, so let's dig into the email.
So the first thing that I kind of addressed was spiritual witness, and that was a big thing for me. Should I just read it?
Please, just read it.
So I just said, every major religion has members that believe that the Spirit of God has bore witness to them that their religion is true, or it's the true path to God and heaven. Just as it would be arrogant for a member of any other religion to deny my spiritual experience and testimony of the truthfulness of the church, it would likewise be arrogant for me to deny their spiritual experiences or testimonies of the truthfulness of their religion. But every religion cannot be right together. And one main point that I had here was all of the different kind of breakoffs of the church. I mean, there's been so many and so many different prophets, and to go to a testimony meeting in the RLDS church or any other breakoff would feel very similar to the LDS church, but the prophets would be replaced. And so they can't all be right together. And so that was a big one for me.
Okay. And I'm going to let listeners know ahead of time that this is going to be the first in hopefully what is a series of 5 or 6 people who are going to be sharing their experiences with Mormon general authorities, because we think it's a very common thing when someone's had a faith crisis to get an audience with the general authority. I did it. I met with Elder Jeffrey R. Holland twice. And we think that because that's a thing, because it's something that's done, it's something that isn't talked about, that there's historical value, spiritual value, ethical value, moral value in people telling those stories, so that in 2017, we can know what it's like to talk to a general authority during this past decade around these sorts of issues. So if anybody has had a meeting with the general authority that they want to actually talk about and share their story, I just want to make sure people know that we're not just doing Trevor. We're going to do 5 or 6 of these and hopefully have this sort of little repository of oral stories of people's experiences meeting with general authorities. It can be good. It can be bad. Okay. So Trevor, once you guys started talking about this question of spiritual witness, I'm going to go ahead and sort of speak back and summarize what we heard from Grow and from Clarke. So what I heard was that Grow immediately went to discuss this issue of the only true church. And it seemed like his point was to say that there's truth everywhere, that Joseph Smith got his truth from wherever he could find it. If he could find some truth in the Masonry ceremony, he would incorporate that into the temple ceremony. He talked about a general authority statement that basically said all the world religions have truth in them. And that was sort of his response to this question. There's truth everywhere, and the church is becoming more expansive. He also seemed to not want to, so then he basically talked about how authority was the point, that while there's truth in all the religions, that authority was where the LDS church had the distinguishing sort of benefit. And so after that, it seemed like he kind of then said, so there's this question of the one and only true church. And I heard him actually say he doesn't have much to say about that. And he kind of even deferred to Elder Grow And Grow didn't speak up at this point. So we're about 17 minutes into the interview.
Yeah, and you mean Elder Clarke.
Elder Clarke,
yeah,
I'm sorry,
yeah,
Elder Clarke, thank you. So how did you feel about Grow's response to that question?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I was hoping Elder Clarke would have been more involved, like you mentioned. And I think Matt Grow also was kind of wanting to lean on him a little bit as well. But Elder Clarke was definitely just kind of letting him do the work. But the thing is how I felt about that is this was something that this is a response that I would have given, in the mission. This is something that I had already thought about, but there's some, in my mind, there were just some kind of issues, some core issues with that, because when God the Father and Jesus Christ saw Joseph Smith in the first vision, they told him that every other religion was an abomination in his sight. And so to now go back on that and say, well, we kind of think that there's, there's good in every church, we're just saying, hey, let us add to that, that kind of goes against, what was initially supposedly said to Joseph Smith from God himself. When you say everything's an abomination, that's a pretty strong word, and so we very much believe that this is the only true church. And I always understood that we had evidence and logic on our side, at least to a certain point, to back it up. And so one point that I made to Matt was, I just said, well, I know that a lot of it comes down to faith. I know a lot of it comes down to, following the Spirit, but where most religions have, a lot of logic and science leading up to a point, then there's a gap to where you find God. I feel like Mormonism is redefining that faith in the sense that as Mormons, we have to believe and have faith despite science, logic, DNA analysis. All of that. And so what I was telling Matt was just, help me at least, make sense of this half of a bridge that should be there that's just not anymore.
Yeah. So if I were to summarize, you feel like, even in Doctrine and Covenants, I think section 1, it makes it clear that all other churches are an abomination. That's been the narrative that we were raised on. And so to some extent, now to just focus on the good and the truth that's everywhere feels like a bait and switch to you a little bit.
Well, yeah. And another thing is, I talked at the beginning when I first sat down with Matt and Elder Clarke, we were talking about, some different concerns that I had. And one of the things in the very beginning of the meeting was that I talked about, as I've kind of stepped away from the church a little bit and been able to look outside in and talk to some of the members of the church, what scared me most is I've started to see what I see in Scientology documentaries, and and what I mean by that is this mind control going on. When you have talks like Boyd K. Packer, when he says, how can I bear a testimony until I get one? How can I testify that God lives? The gospel is true,
They basically say the way to gain a testimony is by bearing it.
Yeah, he says the testimony is to be found in bearing it. And to me, is that ethical? How is that not bearing false witness? Is that not a part of this whole, mind control thing, that's happening? And so that scared me, John. That really scared me. And as I talk to people and they're unwilling to even open their mind to the opposite side, of things, or just the unwhitewashed history of the church and the hidden doctrine of the church. It's scary to me that people can't even entertain that, And so, so that's part of that whole thing as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would just also add that in some sense, the church kind of speaks out of both sides of its mouth, because you can find these isolated quotes where we emphasize the goodness and truth out there. But make no mistake about it, our missionaries are there to convert people away from their faith. We don't consider baptisms of any other Christian church to be legitimate. We don't consider that they have any legitimate authority. And the prevailing, the dominant, the absolute narrative in General Conference through 2017 is, this is God's one true church, and join it or you're not part of God's true church. And so for Grow to be focusing on the good that's found everywhere, it's a nice progressive move. And you hear that from Patrick Mason, you hear that from, Gibbons and others, but it's just not consistent with the prevailing authoritative narrative. And to say that those are in any way comparable or equal or deserve equal weight, it really can't be both. It's either, it's just like, Gordon B. Hinckley has said, it's either everything it's claimed to be or it's the greatest fraud. You can find Holland saying that. You can find, apostles and prophets saying that for dozens and dozens of years. They're the ones who've set it up this way, and it's still framed in this way. And to claim that it's about goodness everywhere is just not living in reality,
Yeah, absolutely. And they did, and there was a part where Matt did confirm, the fact that it is kind of all or nothing with the church. It's all or nothing. So
yeah,
that's a big claim, to be the only true church on the face of the planet. And yet just ask everybody to just follow the Spirit. When something doesn't make sense, or history, DNA, science, logic disprove something, just follow the Spirit. That to me can only get me so far, especially as I'm meeting other people out there in the world that are spiritual, that have had spiritual experiences, and they've tied them to the religion that they have, And so
yeah.
I can't step into anybody else's body, John. I don't know what they're feeling. So I can never say that my feeling of the Spirit is stronger than theirs. Does that make sense? So my whole thing was just, I could no longer rely 100% on the Spirit alone to guide me. Some things started, they need to make sense at least.
Yeah, and I basically call that the epistemology problem. How do we know if something's true? And the church's excessive reliance on feelings, irrespective of facts, is just deeply problematic because, some Muslims believe in Islam so much, they've had such a strong spiritual witness that Islam's true, that they're willing to fly their plane into buildings. So you just can't claim that feelings are a reliable demonstration of evidence that something's true, because every religion relies on feelings as evidence that the religion is true.
Well, and you want to talk about feelings. Just look at the commitment, right? Like you said, flying planes into buildings and these suicide, these kamikazes, basically, they believe that God is telling them to do that. That's got to be a pretty intense feeling if we feel like we're feeling the Spirit, And another thing is you look at Buddhism, and people committing their entire life to the practice of Buddhism. You look at evangelist conventions, look at the Spirit that you feel there. Those guys are getting people on stage that haven't walked in years, that have been sick, and they're healing people. Talk about authority, talk about priesthood. How do you explain these things?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, great. I think we've covered that one well. And I appreciate where Grow is coming from, but I think to me, it just doesn't seem consistent, and it seems a little bit disingenuous. It's sort of like saying these are not the droids you're looking for, when the stark reality is the brethren themselves, as official prophets, seers, and revelators, frame it as the one true church with exclusive authority. And so to encourage people to lower their standards, I think is not consistent with the LDS Church.
Right.
Okay, why don't you read question number 2 about Book of Abraham, and just read the question. You don't even just read it straight so that we know what they read when we had the meeting.
Okay, a lot of these aren't so much in question form, but I'll I'll try.
Oh, whatever. Read the statement.
Yeah, okay. So I just put, we have testable claims from Joseph Smith that can help us prove whether he was a true prophet or not. You shall know them by their fruits. One of these is the power of translation from God. Joseph Smith claimed that he could translate documents from Egyptian or Reformed Egyptian to English. But nobody could cross-check this at the time, since linguistics could not directly translate Egyptian at the time. Today, however, they can, and they have. We don't have the plates from the Book of Mormon. We don't have the Kinderhook plates. But we do have these scraps, as Matt Groh would say, of the papyri from the Book of Abraham, and also the facsimiles right here, actually, still in the canonized scripture in the Book of Abraham. That Joseph Smith supposedly translated. So the fact that Egyptologists have found the source material for the Book of Abraham to be nothing more than just pagan funerary text of a deceased man named Hor, and that none of these descriptions actually match up with the facsimile. Basically, every item that we have to test Joseph Smith's ability to translate, he fails every single time. And so that's
okay. So that was the statement. So my recounting of what Groh's response was to first make the very classic apologetic claim that we don't have all the scrolls. I think he said that we have just 10% of the scrolls, that a bunch was destroyed in the fire. So again, apologists are always going to the gaps to say maybe the truth is in the evidence we don't have, right? As if the absence of evidence sort of proves something, or at least allows for plausible deniability. He does acknowledge that these are funerary texts, and that, just as the essays acknowledge that Abraham, from what we have, Abraham's name, pretty much doesn't appear anywhere. There's really the dating of the scrolls don't date to the time of Abraham. He acknowledges that. And then he goes into talking about what he calls two impulses. He said Joseph Smith, as translator, had a scholarly impulse and a spiritual impulse. And that basically we know that there are times where he's trying to understand and learn Hebrew or Greek, and he's trying to, really translate in the sense of the understanding of the word translate that we all have, which is trying to convert one language into English. But he says there's a second impulse, which is a spiritual impulse, where, like with the Book of Moses, text just comes to him through revelation. And this is basically how he's trying to explain the Book of Abraham. It's a very classic, it's where apologists go these days, that in reality, the scrolls were a catalyst to inspire him to channel God's inspiration. And it's used with the Book of Mormon as well. And I'm not going to editorialize yet on that. But that's basically what he said. And, then he tries to say, Joseph never tells us exactly how he gets the Book of Abraham or the Book of Mormon. It's just by the gift and power of God. And he was very hesitant to allow the word fraud to be used. Instead, he says it's untestable. And then you gave a really good response where you actually said the facsimiles are testable, and they were attempted, to be translated. And the translations are all inaccurate, which he totally recognized. But he basically said, from a secular, intellectual standpoint, you might choose, Trevor, to use the word fraud, but from a spiritual standpoint, you can't say it's not revelation. And so that was basically the discussion of Book of Abraham. So how did you feel, and what was your reaction to Groh's response there? And again, we have no response from Clarke up through the 27-minute mark. And so again, Clarke remains silent during this whole time.
And I remember looking over to Elder Clarke and hoping that he would chime in, but it didn't seem like he had too much to say regarding this. And I don't know if that's from his lack of understanding on the subject matter. I mean, I can't assume either way, but or maybe he was just wanting Matt as the expert to kind of do all the talking. But yeah, I do got to give it to Matt on this one, because like, it's not that like either of us are winning different points or anything like that. It's just, I'm just saying, I can see where he's coming from a faith promoting apologetic kind of, perspective. However, for me, it's just a little too convenient. When you say, it kind of reminds me of the whole idea of, well, sometimes Joseph spoke as a man and sometimes he spoke as a prophet, right? So whenever it's untestable or he's right, he was speaking as a prophet. But when he, for example, sent
whenever
Oliver
it's something
Cowdery,
we don't like, then he was speaking as a man.
Right. Well, he sent Oliver Cowdery to go to Canada and sell the Book of Mormon, right? And that was revelation from God. And then when they went up and did the whole thing and it didn't work out and nobody wanted to buy it and they came back, turns out that he was actually speaking as a man. So it's a little too convenient to say that when he's wrong, he's speaking as a man, right? And when he's, when we can't test it or when he's right, oh, that was him being a prophet. It's the same thing here. It's kind of like, well, yeah, when we can test it and it's proven false, that means it was a spiritual translation, right? It wasn't an actual translation.
Yeah.
So that just seems a little too convenient for me. And like you said, a lot of these things aren't spiritual. They're very literal. Like, how do you explain the facsimiles? Like, what spiritual thing am I supposed to get out of some of this stuff? Answers to the Hebrew word meaning rauki yang. And so it's just weird. And no Egyptian could look at this with a straight face and like actually accept this as historical, legit.
Yeah.
Translation.
I mean, it's clear that Joseph was giving people the impression that he was translating, not channeling spirituality. You know what I'm saying?
Well, he had the alphabet, right? He was taking a very scholarly approach, and there are witnesses to that. And so, 86% or something like that of the Book of Abraham is actually taken from the Bible. So why did he need to really invent? I mean, if most of it was going to be revelatory or spiritual anyway, why go through all of this pain of coming up with his Egyptian alphabet and grammar and all this kind of stuff when really he could have just prayed or looked at his stone?
Yeah.
I don't know. It's just,
yeah.
it doesn't make sense to me, but that's, but I can see Matt's point where, hey, just have faith on it. It's a spiritual translation.
And I think we probably should have started acknowledging how kind it was for Elder Clarke to meet with you. Maybe you did, or how generous it was for Matt Grow to meet, that they were sincerely offering pastoral care. And at least on Grow's part, making a really sincere attempt not to demean you, not to belittle you, but to just share, his best understanding of how this could be reconciled. So there's a degree to which they're working in good faith. They're trying their best to help you, and they deserve credit for their time and kindness and generosity.
Well, these guys don't have time to meet with people like me every single day. I mean, if they would meet with people like us every day, they would have no life, but that's why, I wanted to share this with people, because I feel like a lot of people would love to kind of be in this situation. I think it's ideas that are worth sharing, but I do think it was very, very kind of Matt to take his time, and Elder Clarke. Absolutely.
Yeah. And at least I don't know that people feel like Elder Clarke came off very, very well, but I think most people feel like maybe Grow didn't give the best answers, but he came across quite well, quite candid, very apologetic, but also not demeaning or belittling. So many people feel like Grow came out well. I just want to add something that maybe you've already just kind of mentioned. It's apologists always going to where the ground is unprovable to make their point. And at the end of this conversation, Grow basically says, we need a greater and a better understanding of what being a prophet means. And in theory, that's okay, except for the fact that the prevailing Orthodox narrative makes it very clear what a prophet is, which is to talk to God. And when an apologist takes that move of saying, well, I think we need to have a deeper understanding of what translation means or what prophet means, what they're really doing is defining down. They're basically saying prophet. They're saying it quietly. They're saying it behind closed doors. They're saying it, Givens will say it in a little secret private meeting with a bunch of people who are hand-selected at a state conference. Okay, maybe prophet means something different than what we thought. Maybe translation means something a little bit different than what we thought. But in reality, they're basically lowering the bar and lowering the standard.
Yeah.
And that's not what we signed up for. That's not what people got converted to. That's not what my ancestors got converted to. That's not why I served a mission. And so it's just this constant defining down of these terms.
Do we not know what a prophet, seer, and revelator should be doing?
Yeah.
Within the church? I felt like it was. I don't
know. This comes up later in the conversation.
It absolutely does. Do we touch on it right now? Or
no, let's wait. Let's wait.
Okay.
But I just wanted to mention that Grow starts bringing this up.
Right.
Okay, so the next topic that you wrote about was Book of Mormon. Why don't you go ahead and read your... And by the way, we have 165 people tuned in to Facebook Live. I'll just read one comment. Spencer writes, Book of Abraham should be the nail in the coffin. Can't see how anyone looks past that. I just want to agree with Spencer. If John DeLynn purchased some scrolls in 2017 and claimed to translate them and produced a text that then by Egyptologist standards could be clearly demonstrated to not even date to the time of Abraham, to not have the words of Abraham anywhere in it, Mormon apologists would say John's a liar, John's deceiving people, he's a laughing stock, ignore him. And so I just want to sort of agree with Spencer that what apologists do is they change their standard of credibility for Joseph Smith, where that standard of credibility would not apply to any other non-Mormon, non-prophet in the history of the world, but they're willing to give Joseph Smith a pass. So,
John, isn't that what the apologists say about you anyway?
yeah, they do. And we'll talk about that with Jeremy Runnels. And my only point is just that I'm just trying to reflect what Spencer basically said, which is the Book of Abraham is a smoking gun, and it should by itself alone demonstrate that Joseph Smith was a fraud. But so many people just don't want to accept it,
The fact that it's still in the canonized scripture of the church, it just blows my mind.
And I've actually heard rumors that Terrell Gibbons has been privately recommending to the brethren that the Book of Abraham be removed from the canon because it's not credible. Now, he won't admit that publicly, but I have it on good sources that that's what he's telling people privately.
Well, it makes sense. I think it would be a good move.
Debbie writes, when the facsimiles are there, clearly incorrect in the translation, and they say, oh, that was a spiritual translation, do they not see that they're suggesting that God was fine with setting up his prophet to look like a fraud? That's a really good point, Debbie. She goes on to write, that God, who surely knew that the Rosetta Stone would shortly be thereafter discovered and that Egyptian writing would be translatable, knew that Joseph would be revealed as a fraud if he claimed to have translated the papyri. Thought using the papyri as an apparent source would be fine, ? And I think that's right. That's a really good point by Debbie.
That would be really playing with our minds, wouldn't it be?
Yeah,
I mean, say by their fruits you shall know them, and then just make their fruits completely just hoaxy feeling. That's, that's misleading.
Katie writes, if the Book of Abraham wasn't a literal translation, why the need to spend thousands of dollars donated by the saints in tithing to purchase the scrolls? That's another great point made by Katie. Man, our listeners are very thoughtful. Listeners, please continue bringing up your comments and questions, and we'll read them after our analysis. Laura writes, don't forget the Kinderhook plates. And of course, that's another example where Joseph Smith claimed to have translated something, and they were made up plates with a made up language, just to be able to show that Joseph Smith was just making crap up.
Yeah, but they're not in the scriptures. You know what I mean? Like, yes, that's a good point. I mean, another thing that I brought up is Zelph. You know, and anytime Joseph Smith would find anything, like his credibility of being able to view ancient documents for what they really were, is just completely unreliable, right?
Yeah.
But the fact that the Book of Abraham is scripture, it's in the
sure,
it's insane.
Sure, but there's just Book of Mormon, Book of Abraham, Kinderhook plates. Kinderhook plates isn't necessarily a smoking gun, but if you put all those dots together,
of course,
it forms a line. Annalisa writes, apologists always go to the ground of which is unprovable. And that's totally a great way to summarize. Okay, Trevor, why don't you go ahead and read Book of Mormon, if that's okay?
Right. And, okay. So many things to say.
Did you want to follow up with one other thing?
I was going to say, one big thing that Matt did mention was this kitchen sink approach. And that to me was, and what he means by that is,
the CES letter. Yeah.
Or a lot of people that are kind of, questioning or whatever, they tend to spend a lot of time just boom, 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 just kind of rapid fire concerns and brushing over a lot of things, but without actually going into detail. And my whole thing on that is, because I've heard that before, but my whole thing on that is that's simply not the case. The kitchen sink approach is effective because it gives people a reference point to a lot of things that are going on, but it's not like these are shallow points. There are just a lot of things going on here. So these are my top 5, but I got to tell you, John, it was really tough for me to pick 5 because I have 100 plus concerns. And these are not shallow concerns. You can do research on every single one and get very deep in every single one and see that they check out.
And it's also a weird apologetic defense to say, oh my gosh, there's so much evidence. That's a problem when you bring too much evidence to the table. That's sort of a weird judo move, because the truth is, if there's a mountain of evidence, that should speak to the lack of credibility of the claims, not to the integrity of the critics who are bringing the evidence forward. Now, If the evidence is crap, but the evidence is not crap, the evidence is like completely credible on pretty much every front. By most of the modern, whether it's Sandra Tanner, Gerald Tanner, Jeremy Runnels, Mormon Think, it's all credible. The essays, if they do anything, is they confirm that what B.H. Roberts, Gerald and Sandra Tanner, Grant Palmer, Jeremy Runnels, Mormon Think, Mormon Stories, what they've all been saying is absolutely true and legitimate. So don't use the argument, you're bringing too much evidence, the kitchen sink, I'm overwhelmed.
I would have loved to see the kitchen. When I first started going through this, I would have loved to see the kitchen sink approach from the church.
Yeah.
In response to this, I would have loved to see that. I wouldn't have complained at all. But the things that I see is like, he got this fact wrong. He got this wrong. He got this wrong. And when I look into those where it's inaccurate, and again, we're talking heavily about the CS letter. I don't want to make my entire experience hinge on the CS letter. It's just that Jeremy Runnels did an incredible job summarizing all these points, but it's outside that too. And what I was going to say is the points that they make where, saying the CS letter isn't 100% accurate. When I look into those, it's like, well, you didn't get the spelling of this right.
Yeah.
Or the name of this place is wrong. Or, you know what I mean? Very small stuff when fundamentally the issue's still.
Or the critics are bad people. We'll talk about that.
And I think you did a great job in explaining just, really the last couple of days have been a little crazy for us. It's given us some time to kind of reflect on, some decisions that we made. And, really the biggest thing is that, my whole purpose for coming on Mormon Stories is to share my story. It's not to convince or persuade anybody. This is just a very I wanted it to just be a very raw look at what happened and kind of how it felt for me. I'm not an educator or an expert. I'm just simply somebody with questions that happened to, get a meeting with two very influential people of the church. And I think a lot of times, I know what happened with me is when I was meeting with my local leaders, it kind of felt like, well, I might not have the answers, but somebody, kind of higher up might have them, or, I want to introduce you to this person, this person, this person. And so it just kind of got to the point where that escalated and I found myself in this situation. And another thing to understand is that naturally I'm a documentarian. So I, up to this point in my journey, I documented everything. Since the first week when I started going through this, I just knew this was going to be a big enough deal that I should probably start, videoing myself and my feelings and how I, and just how this was all happening, And so I'm really glad that I did that. And this was just kind of another piece of that for me. It was later on that, after having listened to this several times, John, after sharing this with you, that we decided, we wanted to share this, and I wanted it to be in the best light possible, in the most accurate way possible. And so that's why, we had originally kind of decided to share it, but I do understand that, that people could view it as unethical, and we don't want, the means to any end to distract, or make us less effective in sharing stories, so that's my take.
Yeah. And it was a really tough call because on some level, the church makes such important claims. The church expects so much of its members, and it's not often forthcoming in these sorts of conversations that from a journalistic standpoint, there are many people who feel like it's fair game, especially if there's suicides or families at risk, that it's fair game to have them be on record, especially when it's legal to obtain that record. I think that's a fair argument, but it's also a fair argument to say it's a breach of trust and unethical. And so it's just a difficult choice. So anyway, should we dive in?
Let's do it.
All right. So what was the date? What was the date that you met with Elder in March 2017 with Elder Clarke and Matt Grow. And we're going to have Trevor tell the story. I'll help him. And then we're going to analyze those responses. And we're going to release this as an episode on Mormon Stories so that Trevor's story gets told. So with all that disclaimer, Trevor Haugen, welcome back to Mormon Stories podcast.
Hey, John. Thanks for having me. This is like take two.
Yeah.
Get it right.
And we're doing the recording live on Facebook Live, not because we expect more people to tune in. Again, if you've already checked all this out and you don't feel like you want to listen to it, please don't. But if you do want to tune in, and right now we have 73 people who have tuned in, we do welcome people to share their questions, their thoughts, their concerns, and throughout this discussion, and definitely at the end, we're willing to take questions. Not just about the meeting, but also just about, our decisions to take things down, etc. And again, we don't expect anyone to tune in or listen, but we want Trevor's story to be part of the historical record. And that's why we're re-recording. At least that's why I'm re-recording. So with all that, Trevor, do you want to say anything really quickly about the decision to take down the audio recording? What would you like to say about that?
Yeah,
and Matthew J. Grow, who is in the LDS Church History Department. So that was what we had planned. We went ahead and released the audio recording from that meeting, and then we did a couple hours of analysis with Lindsay Hansen Park, John Hamer, and Glenn Osland. And we released it all. And those of you who have already listened to all that, please don't feel like we're expecting you to tune in and listen to more. But we decided after about a day of having released that, And Trevor, we could talk about this, but basically we decided to take it all down. And we reconsidered the effectiveness of sharing an audio recording that was made in private. And so that's true. However, Trevor still, and I still felt like Trevor's story deserved to be told. And so we weren't comfortable just sort of scrapping the whole project. And so what we've decided to do is to go ahead and have a conversation between me and Trevor where we talk about that meeting that he had with Elder Clarke and with Matthew Grow, but not to release the audio from it. And it's just sort of a practical, pragmatic, and in some cases, ethical decision that we made. And so that's what we're going to do. Over the next hour or two, we are going to have Trevor tell the story of the meeting that he had. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Mormon Stories Podcast. I'm your host, John DeLynn. It's March 29th, 2017, and we are here to interview Trevor Haugen. And Trevor is going to be known to many of you and is not going to be known to others. But basically, let me just give kind of the rundown. We interviewed Trevor about sort of in episode 1 of this series about his faith journey, about his mission in Latin America, about his temple marriage, about his second temple marriage, and about his faith crisis, and all of that. And we did all that in episode 1. And then in episode 1, we talked about how we were going to be releasing in episode 2 an audio recording of an interview that Trevor had with his former mission president, who became a general authority, Don Clarke.